The photograph is small, no larger than a playing card. It is printed on albumen paper, mounted on stiff gray board, and stamped on the reverse with the mark of Halsworth and Crabbe, commercial photographers, of Sallow Lane, Redcliffe on Marsh, Somerset. The date, inscribed in violet ink, reads the 14th of September, 1890. In the photograph, 5 children stand in a garden. They are arranged in a row before a low stone wall. Behind them, a field of barley stretches toward a tree line that no longer exists. The children are dressed in their Sunday clothes, white pinafores, buttoned boots, hair parted and combed with evident care. They are not smiling. Victorian children rarely smiled for photographs. The exposure times were long. The instruction was always the same. Be still. And yet, there is something else here, something you will not notice at first glance. Look at the children's hands. Every single child, all 5, has their left hand raised to precisely the same height. The fingers are splayed in an identical formation. Thumb folded inward. 4 fingers extended at uniform angles, as though pressed against an invisible pane of glass. This is not a natural pose. This is not something a photographer would instruct. And there is one more detail. The child on the far right, the youngest, a girl of perhaps 4 years, is looking directly into the camera. Her mouth is slightly open. And if you examine the image under magnification, as the Somerset Antiquarian Society did in 1911, you will observe that her pupils are not round. They are elongated, vertically, like those of a cat, or like those of something that merely resembles a child. To understand what happened to the Redcliffe children, you must first understand the world they inhabited. 1890, the final decade of a century that believed it was conquering darkness with reason. In London, electric light was spreading through the wealthier districts. The Underground Railway carried thousands beneath the earth each day. Pasteur's germ theory had begun to reshape medicine. The microscope had revealed a universe teeming within a single drop of water. And yet, in the rural parishes of Somerset, the old world persisted. Redcliffe on Marsh was a village of perhaps 300 souls, situated on low ground between the Quantock Hills and the Bristol Channel. The air carried the smell of peat and salt, and the faintly sulphurous odor of the marshland that surrounded the village on 3 sides. There was no railway station. The nearest telegraph office was in Bridgewater, 11 miles to the east. A doctor visited fortnightly from Taunton. The church, St. Dunstan's, had stood since the 12th century, its tower listing faintly to the north, as though leaning away from something it did not wish to see. The people of Redcliffe were not ignorant, but they were isolated, and isolation breeds its own particular form of knowledge. The older residents spoke of the marsh as though it were sentient. They called it the Sallow, not the Sallow Marsh, simply the Sallow, as though it were a proper noun, a name. Children were warned not to walk the sallow paths after dusk, not because of the treacherous ground, though the ground was indeed treacherous, but because, as one parish record from 1873 notes with startling directness, quote, "The sallow does take what walks upon it after dark, and does not always give it back in the same condition," end quote. Photography, in this context, was still regarded with a mixture of fascination and suspicion. Halsworth and Crabbe had established their studio in 1886. Edwin Halsworth was a retired chemist from Bristol. Mortimer Crabbe was his nephew, a young man with an interest in optics and what he called photonic capture, a term he appears to have invented himself. Their equipment was standard for the period, a full-plate bellows camera. Collodion wet plates, later replaced with the more convenient gelatin dry plates. Magnesium flash powder for interior work. They were meticulous documentarians. Every exposure was logged. The date, the time, the duration of the exposure, the chemical composition of the developing bath, the name of every subject. This meticulousness would later prove both invaluable and deeply unsettling. Because according to their logbook, the photograph of the 5 children was taken at 3:17 in the afternoon on September the 14th, 1890. And according to every other record that exists, the 5 Redcliffe children had already vanished by 2:15 that same day. The children belonged to 2 families, the Ashworths and the Fenns. Arthur and Mary Ashworth had 3 children. The eldest was Thomas, aged 11. Then came Eleanor, aged 8. And the youngest was the girl on the far right of the photograph, little Constance, aged 4. William and Harriet Fenn had 2 sons, George, aged 10, and Samuel, aged 7. The families were neighbors. They lived in a pair of adjoining cottages on Briar Row, at the eastern edge of the village, where the last cobblestones gave way to the rutted cart track that led out toward the Sallow. By all accounts, these were ordinary children. Thomas Ashworth was described by his schoolmaster, a Mr. Josiah Phelps, as a steady and capable boy, good with figures, somewhat solemn in temperament. Eleanor was quieter, fond of drawing. She kept a small sketchbook in which she copied illustrations from her mother's botanical almanac with surprising precision. Constance, the youngest, had only recently begun attending the parish school. She was, by her mother's account, a cheerful child who spoke to things that were not there, a habit Mary Ashworth attributed to an active imagination and nothing more. The Fenn boys were more boisterous. George was athletic, a fast runner, known for climbing the churchyard yews despite repeated warnings. Samuel was his shadow, smaller, quieter, but always present wherever George went. These 5 children played together daily. They explored the edges of the Sallow, built dams in the drainage ditches, chased rabbits through the barley fields. They were, in every respect, unremarkable, except for one detail that only emerges in retrospect. In the weeks before the 14th of September, Eleanor Ashworth's sketchbook underwent a change. The botanical illustrations ceased. In their place, page after page was filled with the same image, drawn with increasing precision and decreasing childishness. It was a circle. Inside the circle, 5 smaller circles were arranged in a pattern that did not correspond to any known geometric principle. The lines connecting them curved in directions that, when examined by Dr. Alistair Pemberton of the Royal Society in 1912, were described as, quote, suggestive of non-Euclidean spatial relationships that a child of 8 could not possibly have encountered in any published text, end quote. Eleanor drew this figure 47 times. The sketchbook survived. It is held in the restricted collection of the Taunton County Archive. It has not been made available for public viewing since 1953. The first anomaly was observed not by a parent, not by a neighbor, but by the Reverend Father Aldous Whitmore, the rector of St. Dunstan's. Father Whitmore was 63 years old. He had served the parish for over 30 years. He was a man of quiet faith, moderate habits, and exceptional observational discipline. He kept a daily journal, which he maintained without interruption from 1859 until the day of his death in 1894. These journals, totaling 31 volumes, were meticulously documented and are considered reliable primary sources by the Somerset Historical Society. On the 7th of September, 1890, 1 week before the children vanished, Father Whitmore recorded the following entry. Quote, called upon the Ashworth cottage this afternoon to discuss the Michaelmas arrangements with Mary. Found the 5 children in the rear garden, seated in a circle upon the grass. They were entirely silent. Their eyes were open but appeared unfocused. I spoke to Thomas by name. He did not respond. I touched his shoulder. His skin was cold, markedly so, despite the warmth of the day. I estimated the temperature of his flesh to be no greater than that of a body some hours deceased, and yet his pulse, which I checked at the wrist, was present. It was, however, extraordinarily slow. I counted 11 beats in the span of a full minute. End quote. 11 beats per minute. A healthy child's resting heart rate is between 75 and 115 beats per minute. 11 beats per minute is not compatible with consciousness. It is barely compatible with life. Father Whitmore noted that the episode lasted approximately 9 minutes. Then, as he described it, quote, "The children stirred as one, as though waking from a shared dream, and resumed their play without any apparent awareness that anything unusual had occurred. Constance asked me if I should like to see the door. I asked her what door she meant. She pointed toward the sallow and said, 'The one that is almost finished.'" End quote. Father Whitmore did not investigate further that day. He attributed the episode to some form of childhood game, or perhaps a mild collective seizure, a phenomenon that was poorly understood at the time, but not entirely unknown to Victorian medicine. The condition was sometimes referred to as sympathetic catalepsis, a term coined by Dr. Reginald Fraith of Guy's Hospital in 1881, describing instances in which individuals in close proximity appeared to enter simultaneous states of muscular rigidity and diminished consciousness. But sympathetic catalepsis did not account for the temperature, and it did not account for what Father Whitmore observed 2 days later. On the 9th of September, he passed the Ashworth garden again. The children were in the same circle, in the same positions. But this time, he noticed something that he underlined 3 times in his journal, pressing so hard that the nib tore the paper. The grass beneath the children was white, not dead, not dried. White. As though every blade had been drained of its chlorophyll in a perfect circle, 6 feet in diameter, with the children at its center. The white grass did not recover. Father Whitmore visited the spot daily. By the 12th of September, the white circle had begun to emit a faint luminescence after dark. Visible, he wrote, only from the corner of one's eye, vanishing when looked upon directly. The events of September the 14th, 1890, were witnessed by multiple people and documented in overlapping accounts that are, in their consistency, deeply unsettling. The morning began normally. The children attended school. Mr. Phelps recorded their presence in his register. Thomas answered a question about the tributaries of the River Severn. George Fenn was reprimanded for throwing chalk. Constance sat quietly in the infant's corner, drawing the circle. At noon, the children were released for the midday meal. They returned to Briar Row. Mary Ashworth served bread and cold mutton. Harriet Fenn gave her boys the same. At approximately 1:15 in the afternoon, the 5 children left the cottages together. Mary Ashworth watched them walk east along the cart track toward the Sallow. She called out to Thomas to mind his sisters. He raised his hand in acknowledgement. This was the last time any parent saw their children behaving normally. At 1:45, a farmhand named Cedric Hollow was mending a fence along the boundary of the Sallow when he heard what he described as a sound, like a church bell, rung underwater. It was low, resonant, and seemed to come from beneath the ground rather than from any visible source. He looked toward the marsh and saw the 5 children standing at the edge of the Sallow, approximately 200 yards from his position. They were holding hands. They were facing away from him, looking into the marsh. And then Cedric Hollow witnessed something that he repeated, under oath, to the parish constable, to Father Whitmore, and later to Dr. Nathaniel Greaves, the physician who was summoned from Taunton. The air in front of the children, he said, opened. He did not say it tore. He did not say it split. He used the word opened, as though describing a door or a curtain. He said the opening was vertical, approximately 7 feet in height, and that it was not dark inside. It was, in his words, the color of a photograph. Gray and silver, and perfectly still. The children walked forward, into it, and the air closed behind them. Cedric Hollow ran to the spot. He found nothing. No disturbance in the ground, no marks, no indication that 5 children had stood there moments before. But he did find one thing. The temperature at the precise location where the children had been standing was, by his account, so cold that the moisture on the grass had crystallized into frost. In September, in the early afternoon, he ran to the village. He raised the alarm. By 2 o'clock, a search party of 30 men was combing the Sallow. By 2:15, the parish constable, a Mr. Harold Jessup, had formally recorded the children as missing. Dr. Nathaniel Greaves arrived from Taunton at 4 o'clock that afternoon. He was a man of considerable reputation, a fellow of the Royal College of Physicians, and a practitioner of what he called empirical neurology. He examined the site. He interviewed Cedric Hollow. He took measurements of the frost pattern, which had not yet melted despite 3 hours of direct sunlight. His report, submitted to the Somerset County Medical Board on the 21st of September, 1890, contains the following passage. Quote, "The crystalline formation on the grass blades does not conform to any known pattern of natural frost deposition. The crystals are uniform in size, measuring approximately 1.7 millimeters in length, and are arranged in a helical pattern that repeats with mathematical precision. I collected samples in 3 sealed glass vials. Upon returning to my laboratory, I found that 2 of the 3 vials had shattered, despite being stored in a padded case. The 3rd vial was intact, but empty. The crystalline material had sublimated entirely, leaving no residue, no moisture, and no detectable chemical trace. I have no explanation for this." End quote. But the frost was not the most inexplicable element. The most inexplicable element was the photograph. Because at 3:17 that afternoon, a full hour after the children were confirmed missing, Mortimer Crabbe of Halsworth and Crabbe walked into the rear garden of the Ashworth cottage to test a new batch of dry plates he had prepared that morning. He set up his camera facing the stone wall. He prepared the exposure. He looked through the viewfinder, and the 5 children were standing there. He made the exposure. 14 seconds, as recorded in his logbook. He spoke to the children. They did not respond. He later stated that he assumed they had returned from wherever they had wandered, and that the commotion in the village had been premature. He removed the plate. He went inside to inform Mary Ashworth that her children were in the garden. Mary Ashworth ran outside. The garden was empty. Mortimer Crabbe developed the plate that evening. The image was sharp. The children were clearly visible. Their poses were, as I have described, left hands raised, fingers splayed, Constance staring into the lens with those impossible pupils. But there was something else in the photograph that Crabbe had not seen with his naked eyes. Behind the children, in the barley field beyond the stone wall, there was a shadow. It was not the shadow of a tree. It was not the shadow of a cloud. It was the shadow of a door. A tall, narrow rectangle of perfect darkness, standing upright in the middle of the field, casting a shadow that fell in the wrong direction, away from the sun rather than with it. Crabbe showed the photograph to Edwin Halsworth. Halsworth examined the negative under a magnifying lens and said nothing for a very long time. Then he locked the negative in the studio safe and told his nephew never to speak of it. Crabbe spoke of it anyway. On the 17th of September, 3 days after the disappearance, Dr. Greaves returned to Redcliffe-on-Marsh with additional equipment. He brought a galvanometer, a thermographic probe of his own design, and a second camera, borrowed from the photographic department of the Bristol Royal Infirmary. His intention was to document the site with scientific rigor, to capture, if possible, Whatever anomalous phenomenon had produced the frost, and perhaps the children's image in Crabbe's photograph. He set up his equipment at the edge of the sallow, at the precise spot identified by Cedric Hollow. The frost was still there, after 3 days. In September. At 4:12 in the afternoon, the galvanometer, which measured electrical charge in the atmosphere, began to register readings that Dr. Greaves described as, quote, beyond the capacity of the instrument's scale, end quote. The needle swung to its maximum position and remained there, vibrating with such intensity that the glass face of the instrument cracked. At 4:15, the temperature at the site dropped. Dr. Greaves recorded a decline of 22 degrees Fahrenheit in under 90 seconds. His breath became visible. The moisture on his equipment began to freeze. At 4:17, he made his exposure. The resulting photograph, which Dr. Greaves included as an appendix to his medical board report, shows the empty marsh. Except it is not empty. In the center of the image, there are 5 shapes. They are translucent. They are the approximate size and proportion of children. But they are wrong. Their limbs are too long. Their heads are tilted at angles that would require the cervical vertebrae to be dislocated or absent entirely. Their mouths, if those dark smears can be called mouths, are open far wider than any human jaw should permit. And they are facing the camera. Dr. Greaves reported that at the moment of the exposure, he heard a sound. Not the underwater bell that Cedric Hollow had described. Something different. He called it, quote, the sound of 5 children laughing, played in reverse, and at a frequency that caused immediate nausea and a sharp pain behind the left eye, end quote. He packed his equipment. He left Redcliffe on Marsh that evening. He never returned. In a private letter to a colleague at the University of Edinburgh, discovered in 1938, Dr. Greaves wrote a single sentence about the experience that has haunted researchers ever since. Quote, I do not believe the children are dead, and that is what frightens me most. End quote. The Redcliffe children were never found. The official inquest, held on the 3rd of October, 1890, returned an open verdict. The children were declared missing, presumed drowned in the sallow marshes, despite the absence of any bodies, any clothing, any physical evidence whatsoever. The Ashworth and Fenn families left Redcliffe within the year. Mary Ashworth was admitted to the Wells Asylum in 1892, suffering from what the attending physician diagnosed as acute perceptual mania. She claimed she could hear her children's voices coming from inside the walls of whatever room she occupied. She died in 1897, aged 34. Father Whitmore continued his ministry until 1894, when he was found dead in the nave of St. Dunstan's. The cause of death was recorded as cardiac failure. His journal, open on the lectern beside him, contained a final entry, written in a hand so unsteady it is barely legible. Quote, the door is in the church now. I can see it in the north wall. It was not there yesterday. It is opening. End quote. Mortimer Crabbe's studio burned in 1891. The cause was never determined. The logbook survived, recovered from the studio safe. The original negative of the children's photograph did not. Only 2 prints are known to exist. One is in the Taunton County Archive. The other was in the private collection of Dr. Greaves, whose estate was sealed by his family upon his death in 1903. With the instruction that his papers relating to Redcliffe on Marsh were not to be opened for 100 years. They were opened in 2003, and then they were immediately sealed again. No explanation was given. The cottages on Briar Row were demolished in 1914. St. Dunstan's Church was deconsecrated in 1929 after a succession of rectors reported structural instabilities that no surveyor could confirm. The north wall, in particular, was described as, quote, intermittently absent, end quote, a phrase that appears in 3 separate surveyors' reports and is never elaborated upon. The village of Redcliffe-on-Marsh itself was largely abandoned by the 1930s. The Sallow reclaimed the eastern edge. The barley fields went fallow. Today, almost nothing remains. In 2017, Dr. Lena Voss of the Theoretical Physics Department at Imperial College London published a paper in the journal Foundations of Physics, titled, quote, Localized Temporal Membrane Permeability and the Photographic Residue Paradox, end quote. In it, she proposed that certain locations, under specific electromagnetic conditions, may exhibit what she termed membrane thinning, a localized weakening of the boundary between adjacent temporal states. She argued that photographic emulsions, particularly the silver halide compounds used in Victorian-era plates, may be uniquely sensitive to the light emitted during such events, capturing images of objects that are not present in the observer's temporal frame, but are, in some sense, present in an adjacent one. She cited the Redcliffe photograph as one of 11 historical examples. Her paper was peer-reviewed, published, and then quietly retracted 6 months later at the request of the university. No reason was given. The photograph of the Redcliffe children remains, small, gray, worn at the edges. 5 children standing before a stone wall that no longer exists, in a village that no longer exists, with their left hands raised against something we cannot see. And Constance, the youngest, staring into the lens with eyes that are not quite human. Were they taken? Or did they go willingly? And if the door they found could open,